Hi, my name is Schauder. Nice that you came to my talk. I want to tell you a little about a nice little feature of JUnit. I mean, everybody here knows JUnit, probably one of the most famous Java library that there is. But still, there's a little feature that I found a couple of years ago that many developers don't know, but they should. So how did I find this feature? I was working on a normal project and just looking for something in JUnit. I think I was trying to fiddle around with the ham crest, and I found this weird package, experimental. And well, I'm a developer, so experiments are cool. That's the kind of stuff that really interests me. So I looked into that package and found another package, rules. Like, what? They aren't developing a rule engine inside JUnit, are they? Well, of course they aren't. I looked up what I could find in the internet, which wasn't very much. It was a release note by Kent Beck, some references to earlier works where all this stuff was differently named, but nothing like a real introduction. So this is the introduction. Rules fix or solve a lot of problems that we get with tests many times. One of the most annoying problems that you can have with tests is you have a test that runs fine in your IDE when you run it alone, but then on the CI server, where it runs with all your other tests, possibly hundreds or thousands of tests, it starts failing. And when you exclude some of the tests, it starts working again. And then you hunt it down until you find a test that does a proper setup of something and then forgets the teardown. The mean thing is this test isn't the one that fails. Some completely different test fails because now its setup is totally messed up. And this happens because you can write a test and you can't forget the setup because your test won't work if you forget the setup. But it's really easy to forget about the teardown, because you don't notice it's missing. This is because setup and teardown in JUnit are completely separate things. Two methods, no direct relationship. Another problem that we get in tests is repetitive code. We have a setup of maybe the database, if we do a little integration test, or maybe some Spring context, or whatever, and we have to duplicate that in all the tests. The obvious solution for this is to use a base class. Woohoo! We have inheritance in our tests. Next is we have a base class for our Spring tests maybe, and a base class for our database tests. And now we have a test that needs a Spring context as well as a database. And we get another base class, another base class. And soon enough, we get a mountain of base classes, and that's really not a nice thing, and just replaces one problem with another. Another approach for solving this issue are runners. Many frameworks, including Spring, come with their own runners for specialized tests. But again, these runners aren't combinable. They're runners that are very useful coming from JUnit itself, like parameterized tests. And then we have the runner from Spring, but we can't have a parameterized test with a Spring runner. It just doesn't work. So this is not really a solution. Rules do solve these problems. Until we understand how rules do that, we have to learn how JUnit works internally. When JUnit tries to run a test class, it goes through the class and finds all the methods that implement tests, like with a test annotation. And it wraps these methods in little classes called statements. Statement is a simple interface, just one method named evaluate, which then executes this class. So JUnit goes through the class, through the test class, collects all the tests, and only then executes them. So now, what is rule? A rule is a thing where you can put a statement in and get another statement out. Possibly the same statement, but more likely a different statement. And you can implement that. It's extremely easy. It's just another interface called test rule. It again has one simple method called apply. It takes a statement and a description, we talk about that later, and it returns a statement. And in this case, I implement obviously a pretty stupid rule, which does nothing but showing how a typical rule would work with obviously the interesting stuff left away. So the missing piece now is we have a rule, we have a test class, we have to bring this together. And this is actually really easy. We just slap the rule on the test class as a field. Just a public field typed as test rule or as a type inherited from test rule and annotated with rule. That's it. Now all the tests in my test class get sent through that rule, and in that rule I have the option to manipulate this test. So what kind of manipulations do we get in these rules? Let's start with that, with the example I had in the beginning. The missing after. How do we solve this with rules? Simple. We create a statement that contains the original statement, but before execute some code and after execute some code. Since it's now bundled in a single rule, it's really hard for a developer to forget about it. Just plug in the rule in your test and you get set up and tear down at the same time. Would look pretty much like this. One important thing that's easy to forget, a failing test throws an exception. So when we want to have tear down code, it better is in a finally block so it gets really executed in the failure case as well. Another common example are additional checks. There's actually a couple of rules that come with JUnit. One of them is timeout. You pass it in the constructor a time limit in milliseconds, and a test is only allowed to use that much milliseconds of time. If it takes longer, it will fail with some kind of timeout exception. Another example would be maybe a rule that checks if the test produces any output on system out or system error, something that you often don't want to have in your code. So this, again, an easy rule. Another class, maybe the first class I think I personally used is you can use this, the rule to change the runtime environment or the kind of how you run your test. My first example was I was working on a Swing application, and we had a little test for our custom controls to check that they actually work. They didn't brought up any UI though, so we just coded in them straight inside JUnit, and then after some time we got spurious failures. And then I realized, well, we are dealing with Swing, we better run in the event dispatch thread, the EDT thread. So now I go through all these tests and wrap the inside of all my test methods in a runnable and plug that runnable in Swing utilities invoke and wait. Obviously, that makes these tests really, really ugly, and it gets really hard to see what's actually going on in the test. A perfect example that you can extract into a rule that just does this thing once based on the statement, and then your test is still clean and only contains what is really relevant for the test. So another example would be run tests in parallel. Not different tests, but the same test maybe 20 times to check if you get any concurrency issues. Or run your test in some kind of container. all this kind of stuff can be done in rules. Another thing is tests that can only run in special environments. My personal example were database tests that most of the time ran against an H2 database, but also in a further stage of the CI build, they were run again against an Oracle database. But then we had these special tests that contained code that only worked against Oracle. So we built in a little feature in our rule that set up the database that checked, is this test allowed to run against the database that I'm currently running against? And if that was okay, the test executed. If that wasn't the case, the test was just skipped. Such a rule would look simplified like this. You have a condition that tells you if you want to run the test or not. If the condition succeeds, you just return the statement, you return the statement. And if the condition doesn't hold, you would return an empty statement that just does nothing. Obviously, you have to be careful with this kind of rule because it can make for tons of nice green tests that actually test nothing. So you better check that if you have a test failure inside, that you really get a test failure where you expect it. In this example, you can also see what this description is about. The description is basically metadata about your test. It contains the name of your test method. It contains a reference to the test class. You can get information about annotations that you have on your test method, and since you have access to the class, also to annotations on the test class. So in the almost bottom line, we get one of these annotations and check, get a string out of there. So the test that uses that rule would look something like this. There you have the only on annotation, which contains a string, which is then used by the rule. Obviously, an alternative implementation would be to do the check inside a statement. So always return a statement, and that statement performs the test, depending on when is a good time for you to do the check. The last use case is to provide services for your test. For that, we have to realize our rule ends up as a field in my test class. So my tests have access to that rule. So I can provide some kind of data, some kind of information through the rule to the test. An example, again, straight from JUnit, you don't have to do anything for that, is the temporary folder rule. It creates a temporary folder and allows you to easily create new files, new folders, and takes care of the cleanup after your test. Really nice feature. Another kind of these service rules is the exception collector. We all know a good test should have one assertion at the end, but in some cases, that just doesn't work, and you want multiple assertions. But then you get the problem, which is the reason for having only one, that you always only get the first failure. So what do you do if you have 3 assertions and would like to get all 3 test results? Then you can use the error collector, which is another rule. It gives you an assert that method. And if you use that instead of the normal assertion, it doesn't interrupt the execution of the test. It just collects the failed assertion, and then at the end, it checks if it collected any assertions, and if it did so, it fails the test with a nice report of all the failed tests or failed assertions. Once you start using rules, you probably get to the point where you get multiple rules in a test. And then you might ask, like, which rule gets executed first? And similar to the behavior with tests, JUnit doesn't guarantee any order in which it executes rules. The basic idea behind that is rules shouldn't depend on each other, so it really shouldn't matter in which order the rules get executed. But as so often, in reality, things look different. Consider, for example, a rule that does some database setup and teardown, and the timeout rule. Obviously, to find the appropriate value in your timeout rule, it's very important if you have to allow for setup and teardown inside that rule, or if this can if this happens outside your rule. So in a later version, I think in 4.10 or 4.11, the rule chain was introduced. A rule chain is just another rule which takes a list of rules and applies them one after the other. And again, in code it looks really simple. You start with the rule chain and an outer rule, which is actually the rule that gets applied last, and then you stuff a rule in there and another rule in there, and in the end you get your statement in there kind of wrapped in all the other statements of your rule. And thereby you can control the order in which rules get executed. In the beginning we talked about before and after, and there's something obviously missing. Any ideas? Exactly. If you have before and after, you need before and after class. Just have to be this way. And luckily there's a thing called class rules. And it's really annoying because it's extremely easy. You just use a slightly different annotation. You implement the same interface, just inside your test you don't use add rule, but add class rule. And then you have a rule that executes before all tests, and actually the rule executes before all tests anyway, but the statement gets called once before all tests, and then all the tests happens inside, and you have the chance afterwards to do some cleanup or whatever. I guess this validates as a chance for a little example to see the actual order things happens. I have a little test class here. It has two actual tests down on the bottom, and then it basically has everything JUnit offers to decorate our test. It has a before and after class, it has before and after, and obviously it has rules. One rule chain, same again as a class rule, and each contains two logging rules. The logging rule is, as you might imagine, extremely simple. It just stores a message, and when it evaluates a statement, it just prints the message with a before prefixed, executes the statement, and then prints an after message. So if we execute all this, we can see that the rules, the class rules, wrap around the whole test. They get called in the very beginning and then close up in the end. Then there comes the before class from JUnit itself, and then for each test we get a block of first the rules, then before, then the actual test, and then all the after in reverse order. So I hope I convinced you that rules are really a nice little feature, really simple, nothing complicated here, but extremely useful. there aren't that many use cases. It's if you start using rules, even in a big complex project, I wouldn't expect more than maybe a handful rules to appear, but these rules often turn out to be really, really useful for structuring and cleaning up your tests. And that's basically it from my side. I think we have plenty of time for questions if there are any.
What order will the rules on superclasses and subclasses be executed?
Should be the same as if the rule is inside the lowest class. So you don't get explicit control over it. It's basically random. If you don't like that, you have to use a rule chain, which is, of course, actually a little tricky. If you have a base class, you would need to pass that via constructor upstairs, like something like that. Okay?
Can your rule influence the test results, like force to fail?
Yes, absolutely. The question was, can the rule change the test results? And that's exactly what these tests do, or the rules do, that do additional checks. Remember, the statement is basically a test. So inside a statement that you return from a rule, you can do anything that you normally do in a test, including doing asserts. So you can do assert that nothing was written to system out. You can do assert that no more than a certain time limit was used, whatever you want. And this will throw an assertion exception and will be handled in JUnit just as a normal test failure. There's one over here.
Is there any type of rule for runners, so you can have multiple runners?
The question is if there is any kind of rule for runners. I don't think so.
Do you know any way to work around expected exception rule issue, that for every expected exception you want to test, you have to declare a separate public field at rule annotation?
Sorry, I don't understand the question.
Expected exception rule. If you use the expected exception rule for checking exceptions,
Okay.
and you want to check that the method throws, for example, the same type of exception, legal argument, but with different messages, what you end up having, three at rule annotations with the test case, the three test methods, and you use different instances of that.
Okay. If I got it right, the question is, I think there is an expected exception rule that I don't know exactly about myself, which is obvious to check for exceptions that you expect in a test. And if there's any way to, and if you have multiple exceptions, you would need multiple instances of that rule. And the question is there any way around that, correct?
Yeah, kind of declare at rule once and then just in different tests set it up differently.
My idea would be it should be easy to basically create a rule chain with lots of these rules inside. But since I don't know the rule, I can't be sure about it. If you come over afterwards, we might search for a table and see if we can hack something together.
Do you know that SNG, which is something like GUnit? Can you tell that rule has something like listeners in TestNG?
No, I can't. I know TestNG by name. I've never used it. And I think I assume it's similar, but I can't tell. Okay, I don't see any more questions. So,
Why is it unknown?
pardon?
Why is it so unknown?
Why is it so unknown? I don't know. Maybe I talk on too few conferences. I don't know. It's really, I think it's a big marketing glitch. I mean, I'm just a little blogger and developer, and I found this feature and like had to dig up the source code to find out what is going on. It's really a bummer, but, well, I'm trying to work against it.
Since which version?
I think I found it in 4.7 when it was experimental, and I think since 4.9 it's officially part of JUnit. They did some minor modifications, though, so you will find a variation of test rule interface slightly different and deprecated. That's from back then. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you.